Hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you all for joining the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability for today's Research for People and Planet webinar. Today, our topic is on heat and firearm violence, a study in 100 US cities. I'm your host, Kathleen Rest. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute and the former executive director of the Union of Concerned Scientists. So before we start, I just want to let you know that you can find out more about the study that's going to be presented here today by visiting the IGS website at bu.edu/IGS. And there you'll find Boston University research on a whole host of topics spanning planetary and environmental health, climate governance and sustainability transitions, and the energy systems of the future, all with the goal of advancing a sustainable and an equitable future. So some quick housekeeping notes before we start. The recording for today's webinar will be available on the IGS website, and it's going to be emailed to everyone who registered for the webinar. To ask questions, please use the Q&A button at any point, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. And so now I'm really pleased to introduce our esteemed speakers from the Boston University School of Public Health today, Emma Gause and Jonathan Jay, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So Emma is a research scientist in the Department of Environmental Health. She uses epidemiologic methods and spatial analysis to address research questions that are related to the health effects of heat and other climate exposures and fire-related injuries. And Dr. Jonathan Jay is an assistant professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences. He studies urban health, especially youth exposure to gun violence. And he works at that intersection of data science and community health, focusing on the relationship between urban environments and health and safety risks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Emma.
Okay, great. I will share my slides. Sorry, it started at the end. You got a sneak preview of where we were going. Okay, yes, hello everyone. Very happy to be joining you along with Jonathan today to share some of our results from a recent analysis of daily ambient temperature and firearm shootings. And this work was conducted with a really wonderful co-author team, half of whom were here at Boston University School of Public Health, and the other half, myself included at the time, were at the University of Washington. And the work was in part funded by funds from the state of Washington through the Firearm Injury and Policy Research Program. And one of our co-authors has some disclosures. So many of you might know that firearms are now the leading cause of death among youth in the United States. And about 2/3 of firearm-related deaths are homicides as opposed to suicides. Firearm homicide is also about 2 times more common in urban areas compared to rural ones. There is some evidence that suggests that more shootings occur on hot days, but these previous analyses mostly were from single cities, only looking at single cities or only looking at extreme heat wave days as opposed to the full temperature spectrum. So we kind of identified that there was a gap here to identify whether or not this relationship sort of held up after we control for some known confounders. We also know, and this group probably better than most, that cities are often hotter than their surroundings due to urban heat island effects, which traps elements of heat in the elements of the urban built environment. And we can expect that with a changing climate, climate change can expected to both increase average daily temperatures as well as extreme heat events. So overall, we can kind of see that these two public health crises, the rise in high rates of firearm-related injury and death in the US, and also a changing climate, are happening concurrently and may be particularly of concern for urban areas due to both higher rates of firearm homicide and urban heat island effects leading to hotter temperatures. So really sort of combining and creating this situation of high risk in both of these elements. So we were really interested in seeing, is there an association between daily temperature and firearm incidents across US cities after accounting for known and potential confounders? And we used a time series design using data from the years 2015 through 2020. Our exposure of interest was daily ambient temperatures, and we used population gridded data by city boundaries to assign temperatures, and then converted these temperatures into temperature percentiles because we knew that people become acclimated to their local temperatures. So for example, an 80-degree day in Seattle is very different than an 80-degree day, say, in Houston. And we were also interested in studying the entire temperature range, so not just extreme heat wave days, but any day that is hot or unseasonably hot across all 100 cities that we included in the analysis. Our outcome was the count of firearm incidents captured by the Gun Violence Archive, which uses thousands of sources from law enforcement, media, government, and commercial sources to identify near real-time counts of firearm incidents that happen across the United States. And these firearm incidents included any shooting in which an injury or death occurred that was captured by Gun Violence Archive, and they excluded suicides. So for our outcome, we used the count of incidents or the count of events as opposed to the count of injuries. So anytime an injurious shooting occurred, we counted it as one regardless of the number of injuries or death that occurred as part of that event. We used a two-stage distributed lag nonlinear modeling strategy, which has become quite common in studies of environmental health recently. And it's really flexible, and it allows us to integrate both estimated risk across or on daily risk, as well as risk across a specific lag period. So for example, we can answer the question, is heat on one day associated with firearm incidents on that day, as well as in the following 2, 3, 4 days, et cetera. And in general, the modeling strategy includes first fitting a time series regression model to each of our individual cities, so each of the 100 cities included in the analysis. And then the resulting risk estimates from those 100 analyses are pooled in a subsequent meta-analysis to get sort of the overall pooled association between daily temperature and shootings. And then I just want to note again that temperature here is modeled as the city-specific percentiles to allow pooling across cities with distinct climates. And this is appropriate because, as I mentioned, people acclimate to their local climates. So experiences of heat can differ by cities, but in our overall results, we'll present the results of the percentiles, but these can be translated back to absolute temperatures for each of the city-specific results. So gives us sort of an overall result as well as some more specific results. So we selected for our analysis the 100 cities with the highest counts of firearm incidents during the study period. And you can see these 100 cities in the map here. They're shaded here by their climate regions, so areas that have relatively similar climatological experiences. And you can see that we have cities across all regions, but some are more represented than others. So this graph shows the daily count of firearm incidents for every single day of our study period from 2015 through 2020. And it's very clear to see here that more firearm incidents do occur in the summer months. And there has been some sort of theorizing that potentially this heat and violence or heat and firearm association is just driven by the fact that, kids are out in the summer, there's more things going on, maybe it has nothing to do with temperature and it just has to do with sort of cyclical trends of the year. And so we knew that accounting for this seasonality would be crucial for understanding the heat and firearm incident relationship. So is the risk of a shooting occurring higher on hotter days after accounting for these seasonal patterns or cyclical trends? And the red line you can see on this graph is an example of how we adjusted for seasonality in this study using splines. So it can account both for cyclical trends as well as trends over time. So for example, we could account for that spike that you're seeing in the 2020 year. And as I mentioned, our DLNM approach allowed us to estimate both the risk of firearm shootings on the day of temperature or day of heat, but we could also look at the lagged effect. So how heat on one day might be contributing to the risk of firearm incidents on subsequent days. So the graph here really just shows how risk changes from the day of over a specified lag period. And we can see that the risk of shootings is really highest on the same day, and there is little or no evidence of increased risk on subsequent days or a harvesting effect, so decreased risk on the following several days. So because of this, for our primary analyses, we looked only at the same day heat, but we conducted a number of sensitivity analyses, which can be seen in our article if you're interested in looking at results over subsequent days as well. So this is sort of our main result, the overall pooled association between temperature percentiles and firearm shootings across all 100 analysis cities. And we can see that the risk of shootings really increases sort of monotonically with higher temperatures, with a potential peak in risk occurring at approximately the 94th temperature percentile, which for most cities translates to between 84 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And this peak occurs with a relative risk of 1.17. So, 17% increase in risk on shootings on those hot days. There may be some evidence of greater risk or maybe a decrease in risk at the highest tails of the temperature range, but it's important to keep in mind that those estimates are based on the top 1 to 5% of temperatures included in the analysis, and so they should really be interpreted with caution because they might be imprecise. So overall, we found that approximately 7% of all shootings in our 6-year study period could be attributable to days hotter than the city-specific median temperatures, so what we're defining as hot days. This equates to approximately 8,000 total shootings across the 100 cities over the 6-year study period, although it's important to keep in mind here that this is the number of events, and the total number of persons injured or killed would be higher if there's multiple injuries per event. We also decomposed the heat risk into moderate and extreme heat components to try and see if we could understand what temperatures really were driving this association. So we defined moderate heat as temperatures between the 50th and 90th percentile, and extreme heat as temperatures above the 90th percentile. And we found that moderate heat accounted for approximately 5% of this increase, 5% of the attributable, 5% of shootings were attributable to moderate heat, and about 2% of shootings were attributable to extreme heat. But it's important to keep in mind that looking at that graph from the last slide, the highest individual risk might occur on the hottest days, but that risk is still high on those moderate heat days and is contributing to this increase in risk of shootings across hot days. We also looked at whether or not there was heterogeneity in this relationship by climate region, and we found that there was some differences based on sort of the typical climate region that these incidents were occurring in, with the highest risk occurring in the Midwest and Northeast, and the lowest risk occurring in sort of climate regions that had both sort of hotter temperatures and less change in temperature over the year. So that being the Southeast and the Southwest, which might, pose some questions about what is really driving this relationship. So as I mentioned, we have both the overall results, but we also looked at results by city. And we found that all the city-specific risk curves have an increasing risk of shootings with higher temperatures, but the magnitude and the kurtosis differ by cities. So for example, Seattle and Portland on the bottom here might have an increasing risk with higher temperatures. Others, we see that sort of peak and decrease. And this graph, I really want you to take away that I'll explain. The bottom graph shows the daily temperature in 2020 for a sample of cities, and the top is the attributable incidence for each of those cities. And we can see here that risk is not confined just to those hottest extreme heat days. So it doesn't just happen in July and August, but that an increase in risk of shootings can happen sort of any time that there is unseasonably hot temperatures. So I'll just end by saying, now that we have robustly estimated the risk of shootings across the temperature gradient, accounting for seasonality, et cetera, we found that the risk of shootings does increase with hotter temperatures. And while hotter temperatures, the highest hot temperatures have the higher risk of shootings, risk is not just constrained to extreme heat wave days, but can occur at any time that there is an unseasonably warm day. And overall, we found approximately 7% or 8,000 shootings over our study period could be attributable to unseasonably warm temperatures. And these results also sort of have proposed more questions that we are interested in now. So we know that hot temperatures are associated with shootings, but are there places that are more resilient to hot temperatures? Can we learn from those to understand whether heat adaptation strategies can actually reduce firearm injuries if we go sort of tweak that lever, and if so, how? So some future directions might be looking at reducing urban heat islands, greening efforts or shade, and seeing whether there's some sort of a synergistic relationship between some existing heat-related interventions and firearm interventions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan, for some additional info.
Thanks so much. I'll just talk very briefly about some broader implications of the study. I do want to start by acknowledging Dr. Vivian Lyons from University of Washington, who came up with the idea for the study and really led it throughout. But as Emma mentioned, it's a particularly urgent, important time to be doing gun violence research. We know that gun injuries are the leading cause of death among children and teens. There also was a spike in gun violence of unprecedented magnitude during the COVID pandemic, which brought gun violence rates to record levels in some cities and close to the sort of peak levels seen in the 1990s nationally. And in most of the most common scenario in which a gun homicide occurs is not a mass shooting or a school shooting or one of the kinds of incidents that tends to make the news, but rather the everyday shootings that arise from interpersonal disputes that escalate and where one or both people have guns. So we can start to think about reasons why a hot day might contribute either to there being more of those interpersonal contacts and potentially contacts that might escalate because of the way that heat affects our bodies and behaviors. But I think a deeper element of this work is how it might help us understand another dimension of the problem, which is that gun victimization displays some of the starkest racial disparities that we see for any health outcome. So for example, we recently published a study finding that in 4 major US cities during the pandemic, during this huge pandemic spike where gun victimization of children doubled, there was no change in non-Hispanic white children who had the lowest risks before and continued to have the lowest risk, no increase. And the spike was entirely borne by children of color, such that during the pandemic period, Black children were 100 times more likely than white children in the same cities to be victims of gun violence. And so I think some of this, this heat-related work is the beginning of potentially understanding how environmental injustice, which makes communities of color hotter because of residential racial segregation and disinvestment from the built environment, might contribute to, and which we know creates disparities in heat exposure, might also be contributing to these huge disparities in gun victimization, and where understanding these dynamics could inform violence prevention efforts, either efforts that are focused on people like street outreach and violence interruption, or changes to the physical built environment that we know can calm down violence, like greening vacant lots and increasing access to tree canopy and green space.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma and Jonathan. So now we have a little bit of time for any questions you may have or comments that you want to make. If you have any questions, comments, please put it in the Q&A, and I will monitor them and get them going. We did have a few questions come in ahead of time from people that knew about this study and knew about this webinar. So let me start with a couple of those. One question was, are you looking at any other correlations between climate change and societal impact aside from gun violence?
I can say that our group has recently been working on a study using sort of similar methods to understand the impact of daily temperatures, but in this case on deaths among people experiencing homelessness. That's not yet published, but I can say we have found that, I mean, it's well known that extreme daily temperatures, either very cold or very hot, are associated with greater mortality in the general population. And what we're seeing in hot weather cities, at least, is that among people experiencing homelessness, the impacts of those extreme temperatures are orders of magnitude greater than what we see for the general population. It really extreme examples of the vulnerability of people experiencing homelessness to environmental factors like heat and cold.
Then it's somewhat related, I guess. Aside from heat, are there other climate exposures related to gun violence?
Let me take that in a slightly different direction to think more broadly about environmental exposures related to gun violence. So I mentioned vacant lots and green space. There's strong evidence both from experimental studies and quasi-experiments that improving the physical environments where people live and interact can reduce gun violence. And so most immediately, what we've seen in our research and others' research is that even relatively simple fixes like demolishing an abandoned building or converting a vacant lot to sort of a pocket park are associated with meaningful reductions in nearby gun violence. One of the theories for why this is true is that it increases sort of the capacity for that space to host meaningful social interactions. People get to know each other, they feel safer, and then sort of by virtue of those healthy social interactions, that the spaces actually become safer. And I think this also ties into a long-standing dynamics around disinvestment, particularly from communities of color, dating back many decades, that explains just really dramatic differences in sort of the access to safe, healthy physical spaces that folks have, depending on their race, their income, or social privilege.
Thanks, Jonathan. And another question that came in related to gender. And there was a question about gender-based violence. And I know that you said, that, and I know the study looked at events and incidents, but just wondering if you looked at any information at all related to gender.
We did not, unfortunately. The information that we had from GVA did not sort of classify incidents according to type. And as you mentioned, we were looking at sort of any incident, regardless of who was injured or killed. But that definitely is an interesting, I think there's reasons to believe that different types of firearm related violence might be, affected differently by heat and other climate and environment exposures. So definitely that would be an interesting research direction to explore, but unfortunately we weren't able to do it in this work.
Okay. So Emma or Jonathan, any final wrap-up comments before we kind of close it up?
Just to say that it's been exciting to get to talk to you all about this. I think there's, as some of you may know, there has been many years in which research on gun violence and firearm injuries has been systematically underfunded from federal sources. And so there's still so much that we're learning about how gun violence works. And I think collaborating across disciplines to understand environmental factors, climate factors, political factors related to both of those things are really important for moving this work forward.
Okay, and I know we are now about 2 minutes almost out of time, but just a couple of quick things that came in. Thanking you for a fantastic talk, understanding that you didn't look at suicides, but wondering if you would consider looking at suicides in future work. And another urging you to do a study on domestic violence. So
thank you. Yes, definitely both on our list.
Okay. All right. So with that, I know that we need to wrap up. And I want to thank our speakers for for the study and for an interesting talk today, and thank all of you for attending this webinar. And again, if you want to share this, you want to listen again, or you want to share the recording, it is here on the website. bu.edu/IGS/recordings. You can see it again, or you can share it. So with that, again, with thanks to all of you, and best wishes for a safe and healthy weekend.